Day 7, August 13th, 44 degrees and heavy fog. This bull was a gift from nature.
Well, interesting development. Caribou just crossed right into camp. And I just shot it. Chachi and I are gonna go make sure it's down. Hey, stay. And it is so foggy. Stay.
Not only had I given up on a harvest, but I'd also already called the pilot for a pickup and only had about 4 or 5 hours before he'd arrived to fetch us. And I should point out that this animal swam across federal land and then died on state land, well below mean high water mark. So had I shot this bull in the closed areas of Game Management Unit 23, this would still be a legal harvest. Chachi didn't seem to care too much about land status. As far as she was concerned, this was her caribou and gets right to work.
Well, this is why it shows to be patient. I let the game play out, and I was willing to accept failure as a complete success. And now I've got some fantastic meat to eat.
In Alaska, a hunter's first task once an animal is down is to punch their harvest ticket to legalize the catch.
August 13th. It's official. Let's go skin it.
I couldn't have been happier with this bull. Caribou have so much unique character that each animal offers something new to appreciate about this species. Before I make the first cut, I prefer to lay out my kill kit onto a tarp so tools and such remain clean and visible. This will also be a staging area for my meat as I remove it from the carcass. Traditional hunters typically prefer a knife to skin big game, but I've grown fond of a scalpel with a number 70 taxidermy blade with a rolled tip. Google Havalon knives to special order this number 70 blade. I'm about to demonstrate the fillet method, which leaves the gut sac completely undisturbed. The initial cuts to prep the hide for removal usually start at the top of the skull. This first cut should extend from the occipital bone at the top of the head and extend down the middle of the seam of the animal's neck and backbone, all the way to the tail and down the back of the facing hind leg. To make smooth, clean cuts to the hide, make sure the blade's cutting edge is underneath the skin and above the meat surface. So you'll actually be cutting the hide from beneath the hair, which reduces the amount of hair and cross-contaminants left on the meat surface once the hide is removed. If the hide is desired for taxidermy work, these lateral cuts should extend to half of the chest cavity, well behind the shoulders. This gives your taxidermist enough hide to work with. The goal is to remove the hide to access the meat, obviously, and to minimize the number of cuts I need, I like to pull the hide and stretch it with my hands to pull it off the carcass as much as possible. This technique reduces trim waste and is pretty easy along the back and sides of the animals. While I'm working on finalizing all the prep cuts to free the hide, I leave the hide in place after separating it from the carcass, simply to keep sand from being kicked up and deposited on the meat by wind or my clumsy efforts. The facing legs need a circular cut just below the knee joint, and this incision extends up the back of each leg to join the other cuts already made to the underbelly. Once these cuts are made, I leave the hide covering the meat and return to the head to free the hide around the neck. This cut is avoided if you're going to use the hide for taxidermy purposes. Make the cut from the top of the skull down the jawline behind the ear, and this facilitates full exposure of the neck muscles without having the hide bunch up around the throat and hindering meat salvage. Using your hand or a flat rock like this results in less meat and tissue being left on the hide, which will improve any fleshing time needed before salting. The point here is to make fewer knife cuts and to keep a cleaner work surface on the meat as well as the trophy parts. I carefully remove the lower leg by disarticulating the knee joints. This animal has just swam a river and gotten dropped onto a sandbar, so its hide is fairly well coated with grit, and I don't want any of that on my food. Great care must be taken to avoid accidental contamination at every stage of initial meat handling.
You see, with this approach, you have full access to the neck. And that's important in your salvage requirements for the state of Alaska. And then you can see that more than half of the animal is exposed. A little bit of fat on his seam, the brisket seam. He's not a very fat bull so far. He looks pretty lean. Except for that swollen joint, abscess, or whatever it is. He's pretty healthy. See how the fat on his back looks.
The front shoulder is easy to remove because it's held in place only by muscle and soft tissue. Take your time to visualize how muscles are attached and interconnected. When you're making cuts, aim for that white seam that joins various muscle groups. You'll end up with cleaner meat that makes it easier to keep and to help more clearly identify which meat came from where. This will be very important if I'm checked by a wildlife conservation officer who needs to ensure all edible meat was salvaged.
Watch that artery right there.
Caribou are extremely vascular, so I'm ever cautious not to hastily whack at these cuts to help me control the amount and direction of blood flow that spills.
Not ready to burst that just yet. We can do that controlled. There's the front of the brisket. Follow that down to the bone. There's another artery right there on that facing side. Try not to hit those major vessels. On the tip of his ribs. There's the start of his neck right there.
Considering gravity, I cut a trough to channel the blood that's currently being trapped inside these major vessels in the chest cavity. My goal is to minimize blood on the meat, to keep it as clean and dry as physically possible.
Now you can let all that bleed.
Remove all fat and vessels once they've been thoroughly drained of blood. Manual pressure helps compress the chest and pumps blood pooled in the animal, and these open vessels facilitate this process. To remove the front legs, detach the muscle group of the flank, staying as close as possible to these white seams to avoid waste. You'll feel the leg release once the proper attachments have been freed. I now have full exposure to the neck and rib cage.
And that's his bone, that's his skull structure right there. We're going to cut around this bone, follow this connective tissue line down, and take half this meat.
Most failure to salvage violations involve hunters who fail to remove all neck meat. So make sure cuts begin at the base of the skull and includes all edible meat removed from the spinal column.
See, I've already cut to the bone right there. That's the line we've deemed the middle, and there should be a nice piece of connective tissue right there. Let you know you're in the right spot. And then you just hug this bone all the way down.
Since I'm solo, this meat hook provides an extra leverage I need to effectively control handling these awkward chunks of meat. The spinal column has vertebral collars that stick out like little bumps and ridges that make removal of all the neck a little tricky. It's imperative that you carefully work your blade around these protuberances so not to leave any part of the meat on the bones. Any meat left on the spine will be removed during the final sweep of the carcass before leaving the kill site. To remove the brisket, just fillet it off the bone in one large section. Brisket. Some experts might take exception to my advice of leaving the hide on the hindquarters this long, on the basis that it traps heat in the leg muscles. I chose to do it this way to prevent grit and soil from reaching these best cuts of meat. I can deal with the temperature variables once my clean meat rests off the carcass. And to gain full access to the back strap and hindquarter, all that fat needs to be removed. Some traditional hunters keep this fat for flavor and sustenance, but backcountry hunters have learned how quickly fat spoils in a warm environment. Fat should be removed from all meat if your field stay is expected to be longer than a few days, tops.
Not a lot of fat on them.
Not only does it turn rancid quickly, but it holds moisture and expedites bacterial spoilage.
It's pretty thick back there. It's pretty healthy. I mean, that's quite a bit of fat, but I've seen thicker. That's not bad, not bad.
The backstrap runs along each side of the spinal column and above the rib cage. They're easily removed by filleting the meat carefully off the bones. To free it from the top of the pelvis, I make an incision around the crest of this girdle. This is where the hindquarter and backstrap attaches around the pelvis.
Right there's your tenderloin, so you don't want to cut too deep. So right now you got your brisket, most of the neck meat, the front shoulder, and backstrap. We're gonna let those chill since it's not raining and there's no bugs out yet. Temperature's 44 degrees. Perfect. So right now, all but the ribs and the hindquarters off that facing side. I think I'll work this leg. Off the critical parts back here, and then turn him over on his side so I can get underneath him.
To remove the hindquarter, fillet the meat off the pelvis all the way around and through the femur joint.
You can go so far as to split this joint.
Be very careful with your knife blade once you reach the area forward of the joint and near the gut. A very thin membrane is all that keeps those entrails inside the cavity.
That's where that bone drops off. This tough membrane. It's the only thing separating you from that gut sac. Put that there for now. Before I make a mess. Turn him over.
The hind leg knee joint can also be disarticulated with a knife blade, so there really is no need for a saw. And because I'm alone, I rely on leverage to help facilitate removal of these hind legs. This kayak paddle works perfectly to allow both hands on the task. Alaska state law requires evidence of sex to remain naturally attached to one hindquarter, and all that is required is the smallest sample of penis sheath to ID this animal as a bull. Don't leave any hair or testes with the meat, because they are sources of contamination that you just don't need. You know you've done a great job when there is very little meat left on the pelvis. Very little blood spilled, and the entrails and body fluids are still inside the belly. Next is the flank and rib meat. You'll notice how thin the meat is nearest the belly, and I take all of it by using those white connective seams for guidance. If you're fortunate to have made a lung shot or two, you'll want to carefully remove the rib meat by trimming around the damaged wound channels. If I were hunting in neighboring Game Management Unit 23, these ribs must stay on the bone, but since I'm in 26A, I can legally debone it. I'm doing so now because Chachi's going to be eating it for the next few days.
Alright, flip her over and get her done.
At this point, I'm halfway done. The process is repeated with the same mindful care as the first side. If you need a break, take it now. I maintain a close eye on ambient temperatures because of the exposed meat resting on that tarp.
51 degrees.
Once the climate reaches that magic 50 degrees, blowflies will descend on your food and create problems that are difficult to eradicate. We're talking maggots. So at 50 degrees, all meat goes into quality game bags for protection.
These tack bags are awesome.
Lightweight,
Reusable. Beautiful.
You'll notice at 51 degrees, the mosquitoes have also emerged. Temperature is now a critical factor that backcountry hunters must fully understand if this food is to be preserved effectively. The priority now is to protect the meat from exposure, and that's a decision based on temperature and my time challenges. I do, however, remove all visible hair and dirt as I place each meat cut inside the game bags. Always remove threats that contribute to spoilage concerns. And cinch those drawstrings tight so flies can't crawl inside and have a maggot party.
Well, last thing I got to take off is tenderloin.
To access the tenderloins, I remove the back 3 ribs to gain full access to this choice meat cut. Then you simply use braille and ever so gently trim each one off the underside of the spinal column, keeping the cutting edge of the knife close to the meat but away from the gut sac. If you're a hunter who keeps the heart and liver, remove it with caution to avoid puncturing that gut sac. You should also be aware that organ meat spoils quickly, so if your field stay is expected to be more than a couple of days, I'd strongly suggest leaving it behind or eating it sooner.
It's a healthy looking liver.
In any case, remove the spleen attached to the top of the liver. This isn't edible. And inspect the liver for general appearance. This is what a healthy liver is supposed to look like.
Beautiful.
Some hunters like heart meat. I'm not one of those guys, especially after it's dropped on the ground or has stomach contents all over it. Nonetheless, if you keep it, squeeze all the blood out of it with manual compression and store these organs in a separate bag and treat them diligently like you would the tenderloins and back straps. This is what a healthy heart looks like.
And there's everything off the other side. I have all my meat in tag bags. Feel pretty good. Good day's work.
The last step for me is tool cleanup, which means soaking that tarp in the river to clean it, as well as scrubbing my hands and face to ensure all site contaminants are left at the carcass. I estimated the initial weight of meat removed from this animal to be about 124 pounds, with leg bones intact. This animal represents a healthy Western Arctic caribou. This knot on the caribou's leg is actually more significant than I initially thought. Originally I thought it was just a cyst, but Alaska Department of Fish and Game viewed this footage and they suspected that this animal had brucellosis, which approximately 80% of the animals in the Western Arctic herd have this bacteria. It is a highly contagious bacteria that can cause illness in humans and dogs. So all meat should be thoroughly cooked and good hand washing technique should be exercised. Both Chachi and I ate the meat from this caribou while we were in the field, and neither of us have had any symptoms, but you definitely need to pay attention to this disease and learn more about it. So visit Alaska Department of Fish and Game for more information on parasites and diseases found in big game animals.